Katabasis by R. F. Kuang. Chapter by chapter book summary. Chapter 1. It is October in Cambridge, the beginning of Michaelmas term. While she ought to be lecturing her students, Alice Law instead prepares for the most dangerous undertaking of her life, a descent into hell. Her advisor, Professor Jacob Grimes, has died in a catastrophic magical accident. An accident that, though hidden from the world, Alice knows was her fault. Without him she has no committee chair, no path to completing her dissertation, and no chance at the academic future for which she has sacrificed everything. Her only option is to bring him back, and to do so she must face King Yama, ruler of the 8 courts of the underworld. For weeks she has consumed every fragment of scholarship on journeys to hell, drawing on accounts from Dante, Eliot, Orpheus, even Virgil. None of them agree, and most are incomplete, but Alice has no time to waste. Her funding runs short, and the department expects progress. Today must be the day. She prepares her pentagram with meticulous care, for a single error could mean her death. Just as she steadies herself, she is interrupted by Peter Murdoch, her rival, her opposite in every way. Disheveled yet brilliant, careless yet adored, Peter reveals he has been studying the same forbidden path. With infuriating ease, he alters her circle and insists on joining. Alice loathes him, yet reluctantly accepts. Time is against her. They know the cost of the ritual, half of their remaining lifespans. Alice does not hesitate. Better to blaze briefly in brilliance than fade into obscurity. As the incantation begins, her mind replays Grimes's final moments, the broken lines of chalk she drew in exhaustion, the explosion of flesh and bone, and the silence with which she bore her guilt. No one knew she was there, no one knew it was her error. The world believes it was merely tragedy. Alice knows otherwise. The pentagram ignites. Light and sound overwhelm them. For a terrifying instant Alice loses herself entirely, but she clings to her identity. I am Alice Law, a scholar of magic. The eruption subsides, and when the ash clears they are no longer in Cambridge. Around them stretch endless grey plains beneath a dim, red sky. The air tastes of dust, the silence heavy. Against all odds, the ritual has worked. Alice lifts her pack, steadies herself, and steps forward. The journey through hell has begun. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 draws us deeper into the surreal, unsettling terrain of hell, as Alice and Peter begin their search for Professor Grimes. The ground beneath them is shifting sand that refuses to hold their footprints, a place that resists human presence and insists on its own inconstancy. Landmarks dissolve into mirage, and hell unveils itself in rolling dunes beneath an eternal dusk that leaves Alice aching for sunlight. Soon, they stumble beneath the viewing pavilion, a liminal bridge where the dead glimpse the living and vice versa. Suspended above them shimmers a fractured reflection of Cambridge, postgrads weaving on bicycles, robed undergraduates hurrying down alleyways, and colleagues peering nervously into the lab they left behind. Alice even dares a moment of ghostly mischief, delighting as Belinda shudders at her phantom touch. Yet this glimpse of home is fleeting, a reminder of what she cannot return to without Lord Yama's permission. As they press on, the landscape rises to reveal the fields of asphodel, Limbo's crowded expanse of shades, souls newly dead, wandering in dazed circles, unwilling or afraid to move on. Alice convinces herself Grimes might linger here, too proud, too guilty, too calculating to venture further. But the task of finding him among faceless silhouettes proves impossible. Even her chosen anchor, a plaque from Grimes's desk, fails her, for Peter coolly explains that mere objects, stripped of deep temporal resonance, are useless in hell's shifting orientation. Instead, he performs a sacrifice rooted in taste and time: cigarettes, Lember's bread, port. The smoke curls upward, blurring the fields, and calls forth not Grimes but Archimedes, the department cat, alive, capricious, and unbothered by hell. With a disdainful flick of his tail, he abandons them, leaving in his wake not salvation but 4 haunting figures. They are undergraduates, Grimes's first victims, dead 30 years but still lingering, burned bodies locked in the moment of death, yet eyes bright, voices echoing one another in unsettling unison. They recall Grimes passing through, aloof as ever, barely acknowledging them. They point Alice and Peter toward a distant white line on the horizon where shades queue endlessly for the next court of hell. But when Peter gently suggests they might move on, fear rises sharp and cold in the air. These souls, still children, are terrified not of punishment but of reincarnation, the loss of memory, of magic, of intellect. For them, Cambridge was paradise. To be reborn without knowledge, without brilliance, without belonging, is unbearable. Alice, who once pitied them, grows impatient. Eternity, she insists, will force them to decide. But their parting words sting, a reminder that her own quest, this reckless plunge into hell for academic validation, may not be so different from their refusal to leave the safety of what they once knew. Chapter 3. The wall reveals itself as an immense structure, stretching infinitely in both directions, a pale barricade made not of stone but of bone, packed tightly through eons of accumulation. Before it, a queue of shades sprawls endlessly, their voices rising in a restless rustle like dry leaves in the wind. They mutter complaints about delays, about dwindling birth rates, about a system slowed by the modern world's control of life and death. To Alice and Peter, it feels oddly like waiting outside a nightclub, though the bouncers are absent, and the doors forever just out of sight. Somewhere in this line, perhaps, Grimes may have passed, or perhaps he is already gone, moving with purpose toward reincarnation. Perspective itself offers no certainty in hell. Alice dares to cut through, imagining the incorporeal dead might yield to living flesh, but the shades close around her in a crushing swarm, more solid than theory allowed. They bruise, they elbow, they curse at her intrusion, and she reels from the cold press of their anger. One shade, sharp-eyed and bitter, recognizes her at once, not by her face, but by the chalk dust on her hands and knees. A mathematician, it seems, who spits his disdain at magicians. But in his resentment, he gives them what they most need, news. Grimes has been here, impatient, striding past with such authority that the shades would rather the courts admit him quickly, if only to be rid of him. A day, a week, a month, it is impossible to measure, but the message is clear, he has gone on ahead, and they are already behind. Peter's gaze turns upward. The wall, for all its grim construction, offers handholds aplenty. Bone juts like rock, grooves invite toes, and the surface, stripped of gore by time, is as climbable as any cliff face. Alice takes the lead, chalking her hands with practiced care, recalling Colorado ascents and the mountaineering club back at Cambridge. She moves swiftly, confidently, finding in the rhythm of the climb a strange meditation that quiets her restless thoughts. But Peter falters. Halfway up, fear grips him, sweat blinds his eyes, his limbs tremble violently, and he confesses through gasps that he is having a panic attack. Alice laughs at first, incredulous, then steadies into the role she knows too well, guiding someone through fear with firm words, the same way she once coaxed students through Grimes's merciless seminars. Step by step, breath by breath, she talks him upward, reminding him to trust his body, to hook with fingers rather than pinch, to move without hesitation. At last she hauls him over the edge, and he collapses atop her, sobbing in exhausted relief. In that moment, vulnerability alters the shape of their companionship. Alice feels the old tangle of memory and discomfort at his dependence, the strangeness of him appearing human rather than untouchable. She focuses instead on her own exhaustion, the pain in her limbs, and the satisfaction of having survived the climb. But when Peter looks at her with a wide, open expression, childlike, unguarded, she recoils inwardly, remembering a time when both of them had once shared such openness. That part of their history has long since been buried, and to see it resurface unsettles her. Together they peer over the other side. At first, Alice sees chaos, shifting shapes, seas that churn into deserts, labyrinths that warp into cityscapes. Her mind, overfull with patterns, offers up serpents, wolves, corpses, even Cambridge itself, but the terrain below refuses to settle. It is an autostereogram in motion, a trick of perspective that seems to redraw itself with every blink. The 8 courts may be there, hidden in the transformations, but no map holds. Pain stabs behind her eyes when she tries to force the vision into sense, and when she looks to Peter, she sees him pressing his temples, struggling too. Still, he whispers, "We're going in there." Alice answers with confidence she does not entirely feel, "Yes." For she knows the only way to move forward, in hell, in graduate school, in any impossible climb, is to keep faith with delusion. 1 foot, then the next. Down into the shifting courts they must go. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 carries us down from the perilous climb into a quieter, more unsettling descent into the realities of both hell and Alice's own ambitions. The physical act of climbing down the Great Wall is exhausting, demanding precision and trust in invisible footholds, but it is also symbolic. The thrill of ascent gives way to the sobering weight of retreat. Peter and Alice finally land back on solid ground, but what awaits them is an empty, endless expanse, flat desert stretching without promise or direction. After so much effort, there is nothing to claim as progress. The two are forced to rest in the shadow of the wall, caught between their pride and their sheer physical depletion. As night falls, they discover hell has its own strange rhythms, a sun that dims and vanishes, a darkness so absolute it is nearly suffocating. In this silence, they make camp, share fire, and divide their rations. The stillness opens a fragile space for conversation, and into that space creeps the complexity of their shared history. What begins as gratitude for survival shifts into uneasy reflections on Professor Grimes, the man they both followed, both feared, and perhaps both loved in different ways. Peter's casual observation that Alice never seemed entirely comfortable with the professor touches a raw nerve, one Alice cannot fully deny. Jealousies and buried tensions soon surface. Peter reveals he has won the prestigious Cook Fellowship, a prize Alice had once been assured was hers. The revelation cuts deep, pulling Alice into a spiral of remembered promises, rising hopes, and the bitter taste of disappointment when Grimes's encouragement turned to silence. In turn, Alice retaliates with her own weapon, the memory of a summer in Italy with Grimes, a trip that had once been Peter's to claim. What follows is not outright hostility, but the thinly veiled sparring of two rivals who cannot quite let go of their need to wound, nor of the strange intimacy their rivalry has always carried. Yet exhaustion tempers conflict. They apologize, awkwardly, recognizing the futility of fighting when survival demands cooperation. The small gesture of sharing a blanket in the cold creates a fragile truce. Alice, lulled by Peter's steady breathing, falls asleep for the first time in peace, dreamless at last. But as the narrative folds inward, the chapter expands into reflection. We are reminded of the unforgiving nature of the academic path Alice has chosen, the cult of sacrifice, the hollow assurances about alternative careers, the unspoken truth that anything outside the academy is failure. Her choice of Grimes as an advisor, despite repeated warnings, was not naive but calculated. She craved the prestige, the danger, the chance to prove herself exceptional where others had failed. The stories of broken students, the vanishing of Olivia Kincaid, the whispered warnings, all of it only deepened Alice's resolve to endure. 4 years, she believed the cruelty was a crucible, that suffering was a necessary prelude to greatness. Now, with Grimes dead and her own path unraveling, that faith lies fractured. She had been so close, she thinks, to the reward promised for her devotion. So close to escaping the trial. And yet here she is, in hell, beside her rival, still clinging to the dream that refuses to die. Chapter 5. Alice wakes to find Peter's arm draped across her chest. For a brief, drowsy moment she lets it be, warmth in the cold of hell, a strange comfort she hadn't expected to find. But reality asserts itself quickly, and with it, embarrassment. What follows is a comedy of discomfort, the kind only possible when two people who once shared trust and intimacy are now bound together by necessity and regret. Peter stammers apologies, Alice hides her burning face behind her hands, and both of them wrestle with the indignities of embodiment in a place where dignity is stripped away at every turn. Even breakfast, meager and tasteless, is conducted under the heavy weight of silence. But necessity has no patience for embarrassment. Once the awkwardness subsides, their attention shifts back to survival and navigation. Maps are unfurled, theories proposed, and here their intellectual sparring returns with force. Peter clings to the geometry of Orpheus, envisioning hell as a spiral, a place of non-Euclidean twists where shortcuts to the center might exist. Alice, ever the historian, counters with the accumulative theory, insisting the courts proceed in karmic order. Pride, desire, greed, each sin building upon the last. Their notebooks, side by side, capture the split between them, one mind searching for mathematical elegance, the other anchored in textual lineage and cultural memory. It is frustrating, yes, but also strangely familiar, even comforting. In their arguments, Alice recalls the laboratory days, late nights of conjecture and rebuttal, Peter's logic offsetting her instincts. For a flicker of a moment, she feels the ache of what they once had, a collaboration that sharpened them both. Yet beneath their debate lies the shadow they cannot name. Whatever map they choose, whatever path they take, it must lead to Professor Grimes. And though they skirt around the question, both are thinking of the sins he committed, students destroyed, lives bent or erased, cruelties masked as mentorship. Neither of them dares to name it fully. To do so would demand an honesty neither is ready to give. Hell itself seems to intervene before they can push further. The great wall of bone they scaled vanishes, dissolving into air as though it had never been. The message is clear, there is no retreat. No way back to the fields. Only forward, only through. And then, as if summoned by their thoughts, the world reshapes itself. Mist curls, parts, and reveals a landscape they both know too well, towers of stone, cloisters, courtyards, paths meant for bicycles and scholars' feet. The architecture of learning, austere and timeless. Cambridge, reborn as a court of judgment. Here is hell, and it wears the face of academia. A mirror to their own world, a cruel reflection of the lives they have lived, the lives they have sacrificed to study. And in this unveiling lies the quiet horror of recognition. Because hell, they now see, does not invent punishments out of nothing, it holds up the world one knew, twisted just enough to strip away its illusions. Peter says it aloud, voicing the truth neither wanted to confront, hell is a campus. Chapter 6. When beneath the great gate of hell's first court, Alice feels a familiar thrill rather than dread. For her, a new institution always carried the promise of reinvention, the first day at a new school, the discovery of tucked-away corners in a library, the possibility of becoming the kind of person who belonged. Even here, in the underworld, that instinct flickers, an almost dangerous longing to fit in. Hell, at least in this form, looks less like torment and more like an ancient campus, orderly, neoclassical, eerily quiet in the absence of undergraduates. No chatter, no clumsy hustle, no restless energy. Just silence, which Alice finds comforting after so much noise in her own mind. Yet this campus has only one path, one progression, no shortcuts. The world itself insists, hell is not to be wandered. It is to be endured in order. First pride, then the rest. And so Alice and Peter step into the first court, Superbia. Pride is a library. A magnificent one, stained glass, marble floors, bankers' lamps, leather chairs, the kind of library that whispers importance into the minds of its scholars. At first it seems idyllic, almost welcoming, but the deeper they walk, the more the atmosphere curdles. The shades here bustle with tense, irritable energy. They mutter, slam books, hiss shush at one another. Each is burdened with the same impossible assignment, define the good, defend it, and only then pass onward. It is here that they meet the collapsed figure of Werner, a student broken by endless failed attempts, and then George Edward Moore, pipe-smoking, affable on the surface, yet quickly revealed as a gossip, a petty cataloguer of others' flaws. He ushers them on a tour of the stacks, pointing out philosophers and scholars frozen into statues by their own failures, bronzed into pedestals for eternity. Pride's punishments are not flames but futility, endless research without progress, ideas that slip away as soon as they are grasped. Alice listens, skeptical. Surely Professor Grimes would not be confined here among impostors and posers. His arrogance was not peacocking but, she insists to herself, earned. Pride's petty sins, reminding others of exam scores, hoarding books, claiming false credentials, feel beneath him. Her loyalty sharpens into urgency. Grimes cannot be here, and every wasted moment is another in which he gains distance. Still, Moore clings to them, eager for company, especially from a Cambridge man like Peter. His geniality begins to sour. When Alice presses him about leaving without playing the game, he grows defensive, then threatening. Smoke curls thickly from his pipe, barring the way. It is Alice, in the end, who finds the escape, not through force, but through reason. She challenges Moore on his own ground, unraveling his syllogisms with deliberate pedantry until he collapses into endless premises, trapped by his own logic. While he scratches furiously at his desk, Alice and Peter slip away, down through the buzzing stacks and study rooms, until they burst out at last into open air. Behind them, the library roars with commotion, shades whispering that someone has passed. But Alice and Peter do not linger. Ahead lies the river. And with it, the next stage of hell. Chapter 7. Lethe is a river that is not merely water but a paradox made liquid. From a distance it appears a still, black, silent mirror, but focus for too long and it unravels into chaos, a shifting flood of memories, human fragments dissolving into the current. A teddy bear, a hand reaching, the taste of wine, all caught for an instant before vanishing again. Every culture gives the river its own name, Apanohuaya, Vitania, Meng-Po's stream, but all agree on its boundary, punishment on one side, rebirth on the other. This river alone carries the power of oblivion. To drink is to forget is to change. Alice studies the Lethe with both awe and dread. Philosophers had called it a river of flux, a place where identity itself could not persist, where forgetting became death and rebirth in one stroke. And though the literature warns against it, against even a fingertip grazing the surface, Alice feels its pull. The thought of letting go of her own thoughts, their loudness, their relentless press, tempts her like nothing else. She sees, or believes she sees, Lady Meng-Po, the old woman of myth brewing memory into wine, smiling gently and urging her to drink. How peaceful it would be, to be emptied. To lay her burden down in those waters. The enchantment nearly succeeds. Without realizing, Alice drifts halfway into the river's embrace, ready to surrender. But Peter drags her back, forcing her eyes away from the black surface and onto his own. He steadies her with a simple catechism, her name, her discipline, her place in the world. These truths act as rope, pulling her mind from dissolution. Step by step, they return to the path, Alice shaken, ashamed, unsure if Meng-Po was ever truly there at all. Their journey along the Lethe grows strange. The second court, desire, never seems to draw closer, though they walk for what feels like hours. Peter insists they are caught in hyperbolic space, trapped in geometry itself, but Alice resists his theories. Better to search methodically, court by court, than to gamble on shortcuts. Still, unease lingers. The silence of the path is wrong. No shades appear. Only the river whispers its lull. Then the clicking begins. Faint at first, then multiplying, until it resolves into something unmistakably alive. Over the dunes shuffle creatures unlike anything Alice has read in any text, skeletal animals, dogs, foxes, wolves, stitched together by lines of chalk. Their bones clack with each movement, their sockets empty, their jaws sharp. At first, Peter finds them curious, even endearing, until one lunges for his arm, ripping his sleeve with teeth that cut almost to the bone. Only the Lethe saves them. Alice realizes the chalk-born creatures cannot cross too near its waters. Chalk thrives on memory, on echoes of life, and the Lethe devours memory whole. Herding them backward toward the river forces the creatures to retreat, though not without menace. They vanish over the horizon, leaving only the scrape of Peter's arm and the churn of the river behind. Alice's calm is broken. For where there is chalk, there must be a hand wielding it, a magician alive within hell. Not a shade. Not a relic. Someone capable of working beyond the known limits of magic. And if such a hand had stitched these bonehounds together, then it meant one thing beyond doubt. They were not alone. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins in exhaustion. Alice and Peter finally make camp along the Lethe's banks, too shaken by the bone things to rest easily. Fear lingers with Alice like grit in her throat, the sense of being watched, stalked, and though they've walked for miles, she knows distance means little in hell. Still, habit sustains her: eat, tend wounds, keep despair manageable. Graduate school had trained her for this rhythm, catastrophe postponed, folded neatly into tomorrow. Peter tends to his arm, the wound raw but not yet infected, and soon his restless curiosity takes over. He pulls out his chalk and proposes a shortcut, one that might bend hell's infinitude into something finite using the geometry of Gabriel's horn. He explains with delight, hyperbolas spun into trumpets, bounded volumes within infinite surfaces, while Alice struggles to follow, torn between irritation at his arrogance and admiration for his brilliance. He attempts a demonstration, but the spell won't hold. The chalk markings sink, erased by hell's silt as though swallowed alive. Alice tries her own spell, something simple, something she knows should work, but her pentagram too vanishes without a trace. No Sorites, no heap, no spark. The dreadful truth dawns, magic itself fails here. Not merely weakened, but gone. Hell eats it whole. The weight of this discovery breaks something open in Alice. She had come prepared to hike without magic, with food and knives and resolve, but the loss of their only real defense crushes her composure. Panic seizes her in images too vivid to ignore, vultures circling, lions tearing prey, beasts waiting to devour them alive. She looks at Peter and sees not a companion, but a skeleton, and for the first time since arriving in hell, she feels truly doomed. Yet Peter remains steady, even light-hearted. He teases about chalk brands, shares a memory of a fellow student who hoarded fine Japanese chalk, and somehow coaxes Alice into laughter. The laughter turns too quickly to sobbing, raw and unstoppable, but Peter does not mock her. He offers a tissue, a clumsy pat on the shoulder, and above all, an unyielding optimism. To him, Cambridge had been the closed loop. Hell, by contrast, was possibility. Fun. Infinite space beyond the edge of the map. His certainty is not born of naivete but of conviction, better the unknown than the cage. Alice remembers the intuitionists then, the magicians who argued that all spells, in the end, were acts of belief. Not mathematics, not proofs, but the courage to deceive yourself just enough to make the world shift. And perhaps that is true not only of magic, but of survival. So she builds herself a staircase of small, grounding truths. I am Alice Law. I am a postgraduate at Cambridge. I study analytic magic. I am in hell. And everything is fine. The reassurance lasts only a moment. A blur cuts across the fire. Peter startles. Alice screams, but it is only Archimedes, her familiar, leaping back into her arms, blooded, trembling, and terrified. He presses himself against her ribs, wounded by something unseen. The bone things. They are still out there. Alice racks her memory of Sojourner's accounts, Dante, Orpheus, Aeneas, Brendan, all full of demons and gods, but none of them mention such creatures. No accounts except Eliot's. The wasteland. Shadows that follow at dawn, shadows that rise at dusk. And now, in the silence of hell's dunes, Alice understands Eliot's warning. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 takes Alice and Peter into the Court of Desire, a place far removed from the dunes of pride but no less insidious. Led by the impatient Archimedes, they enter expecting lurid spectacle, but instead find something more banal and unsettling, a parody of a student center, fluorescent lit, soured by stains and mold, humming with faint static music. Desire, it turns out, is not gilded luxury, but addiction distilled, an endless repetition of compulsions, each shade lost in an isolating cycle of indulgence. A goblet of thick liquid, a pipe, a book's spine, bodies clinging to their cravings with mechanical persistence. What shocks Alice is not grandeur, but the pettiness of it, the quiet horror of decay disguised as satisfaction. For Alice, who had lived under Professor Grimes's ascetic creed, that pleasure was filth, distraction, degeneracy, this confrontation is almost unbearable. Cambridge's Department of Analytic Magic had taught her to disown her body, to starve herself into ethereal mind alone. Yet here, in Desire, the body is unavoidable, displayed in grotesque excess. The more she looks, the more suffocated she feels, until she insists Grimes could never be trapped here. To her, lust is weakness of will, and whatever Grimes was, he was not weak. Peter, unusually sharp and cold, challenges her reverence, suggesting she has blinded herself to his failings. But Alice's bravado falters when they open a door onto a grotesque scene of shades writhing in exaggerated, almost caricatured sex. The images collapse upon her, overwhelming her memory, mingling every past intimacy with the grotesque tableau before her. She staggers, sickened, and flees, vomiting into the storm outside. The assault is not merely external, it touches something she cannot name, a confusion of longing, shame, and the echo of Grimes's own impossible demand, to desire nothing but truth, to let the work consume her. Yet she cannot reconcile that command with the gnawing hunger she carries. The storm outside becomes a grim mercy, washing her raw nerves until another threat rises, a pack of bone creatures, stitched together from many forms, advancing with unnatural speed. Alice and Peter attempt to defend themselves, knives clumsy in their hands. In desperation, Alice seizes upon an idea, the waters of the Lethe. One splash proves devastating to the chalk-born beasts, corroding their forms to ruin. For a moment it seems she has found the weapon they need. But before they can secure victory, the creatures hurl themselves upon her, dragging her down. The chapter ends with Alice's balance breaking, her body pulled with them into the black, amnesiac waters of the river. Chapter 10. Chapter 10 begins with Alice dragged back from the edge of Lethe, sputtering and shaken, yet intact. Peter hovers in a panic, pelting her with questions, her name, the date, her favorite Beatles song, as though trivia could anchor her to memory. And to her relief, she answers them all. Whatever curse the river carries, she has resisted it. Her staircase of memory still stands. But her relief is mingled with pain, wounds on her arm, bite marks that throb as Peter steadies her through the storm. Leaving the court of desire is no simple exit. The storm itself seems unwilling to release them, winds and rain driving them back toward that place of decay. Step by agonizing step, they push through until the sky suddenly clears, leaving them shivering on the borderland between desire and greed. By the fire, Alice admits something she has never confessed: she is immune to Lethe. Not by chance, but by design. With trembling hands she rolls up her sleeve, revealing the impossible, an etched, permanent pentagram, inscribed not on stone or chalkboard but into the living flesh of her arm. A violation of everything magic was supposed to be. Peter stares, aghast, and Alice explains what Grimes had achieved in Venice, the summer of experiments, the shaved animals, the corpses she disposed of, and finally, her own skin under his needle. She insists it was her choice. She wanted it. She let him. And when the circle was closed, her memory became something monstrous and infinite, incapable of forgetting, forever burdened with every humiliation, every mistake, every page she had ever read. Peter listens with a mixture of horror and pity, while Alice bristles at both. To her, this was never abuse. It was greatness. She was his chosen, his proof of concept, his living pentagram. That the world whispered otherwise, that colleagues hinted, that students muttered about exploitation, only hardened her resolve to defend him. For what she had gained was undeniable, even if it came with agony. The conversation turns, unexpectedly, into a strange communion. Peter admits to his own complicity, stealing human organs at Grimes's request, too cowed or too devoted to refuse. Together they swap stories, half in shame and half in laughter, of the humiliations, the cruelties, the bizarre errands and impossible demands Grimes inflicted on them. And in that laughter, something warm flickers, an almost nostalgic camaraderie, the bond of soldiers who survived the same tyrant. He was a bully, a tyrant, but he was their tyrant, the man who made them feel chosen, necessary, part of a dying lineage of giants. Later, while Peter sleeps curled in awkward angles, Alice watches him with a tenderness she does not want to admit. She tells herself it is hell playing tricks, this sudden rush of affection. To distract herself, she rifles through his scattered notes, and what she finds makes her blood run cold. Pages of logic, a proof she once chased and failed to capture, the forbidden spell of organic exchange. On one side of the equation, Grimes's name. On the other, her own, written in Peter's sharp, spidery hand, underlined, punctuated with question marks. The implication is undeniable. Peter, somehow, intends to trade her life for Grimes's, to resurrect their master at her expense. She claps a hand over her mouth, choking down a sound of panic, staring at his sleeping form. In that moment, every shared laugh, every tender glance, every ounce of trust curdles into dread. For all their shared suffering, for all their loyalty to Grimes, Peter's loyalty may run deeper still, deep enough to damn her. Chapter 11. Chapter 11 unfurls like a lecture disguised as memory, the axioms of classical logic serving as scaffolding for Alice's fractured recollections. The law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, principles that seem so clean on the page, and yet collapse when applied to the swamp of human bonds. Are she and Peter friends, or not? The proposition refuses to resolve. Schrodinger's cat lives in the box, Alice and Peter live in the paradox. The memory sharpens into Cambridge light, golden, brisk, a season when beginnings still carried the shine of promise. Alice, all nerves and yellow lace, trying to pass for polished, failing in ways invisible to her cohort but glaring to herself. Belinda glittered like an English fairy tale, the Europeans exuded casual mastery, even Calvin, bumbling with teacups, seemed more at ease than she. Alice, meanwhile, felt like an imposter in costume. Then came the shadow that made them all pause, Peter Murdoch, whispered about before he arrived, a myth in human shape. When he finally appeared, tousled, awkward, owlish, Alice felt the ground tilt. Not a god, not a hero, but magnetic nonetheless. His attention made her pulse stumble, his absence hollowed her out. That first missed meeting at the Pickerel Inn was a lesson she would relearn 100 times over. Peter's charm was real, but so was his elusiveness. He showed up rarely, and when he did, he burned too brightly to forget. Alice learned not to wait. She learned not to hope. But she could never quite stop. Their years together wove a strange rhythm, his erratic vanishing, his dazzling returns, his knack for making the unbearable bearable. Nights in the lab, laughter that left them breathless, half-intimate gestures she could never decide whether to keep or discard. And always the abyss, that gulf that swallowed whatever she might have meant to him. Logic faltered here. The truth of their bond could not be forced into yes or no. Alice, for all her extraordinary memory, could not solve him. She could not make the contradictions collapse into coherence. All she could do was coexist with the paradox named Peter Murdoch. Chapter 12. Alice dreamed, and dreams no longer brought respite. They were collisions, jagged memories and grotesque inventions stitched together, leaving her shaken when she woke. That night she found herself stalking tunnels with Professor Grimes, only he bore a horse's head, she slit his throat, drank his blood, and woke gasping to Peter's hand on her shoulder. He had risen early, brewed tea, and laid out lembas with an air of gentle competence. For a moment the scene might have been comforting, Archimedes loafing smugly, Peter pouring Darjeeling, but unease coiled tight beneath Alice's ribs. She had read his notes. She knew enough to suspect him. Was his kindness genuine, or a mask he wore to lure her deeper? She forced herself to pretend, because she could not yet afford not to. They pressed on toward Greed, the slope breaking into a ragged abyss, the Lethe now a roaring current below. The path wound in perilous steps, Peter joked, offered riddles, caught her when she stumbled. She seethed at the comfort of his hand and burned at every failed riddle, every reminder of the yardstick Grimes had once set for her, keep pace with Murdoch. Not surpass, keep pace. He was born charming, with polish and connections, she had only labor, hunger, perfection. Each triumph of hers seemed diminished against his ease. And she remembered, with a bitterness that still scalded, the day she overheard him mocking her, reducing her to something small, laughable. For him it had been nothing. For her, it had ruined everything. Other shades crowded the descent, a funnel of souls driven toward the same end. Alice scanned their faces, wondering what brand of selfishness had delivered them here. She thought of Grimes, but greed had never been his sin. Academia did not breed fortunes, only truth, or the semblance of it. Peter, meanwhile, made a game of guessing their crimes, plagiarizers, trustees, deans. His jokes might have been funny if they did not so great. At last they found a bridge, vast and ornate, carved from the cliff itself, until they realized it was built of shades. Souls petrified into steps, their moans a chorus underfoot. Alice crossed in unease, thinking absurdly of music, of the way Mozart might be played on those groaning notes. But greed showed itself soon enough, two shades jostling for space until one shoved the other clean off a ledge. No matter, The fallen one rose and crawled on. Dignity lost, but not life. Peter, in delighted recognition, named the aggressor, Bill Cador, a semiotician who had destroyed a rival with fabricated accusations, then denied it until the end. Alice was appalled, but when Peter condemned the act with almost performative horror, she snapped back. Was he really so innocent? The exchange curdled, unease prickling sharper. Then came the laughter. At first faint, then undeniable, a woman's giggle echoing off the stone. Alice whirled, searching. Archimedes bristled. And then the colors unfurled, a storm of silk and light resolving into a woman of impossible beauty, weaving threads from the air itself. The weaver girl, Alice realized, the goddess of forbidden lovers, condemned to meet her cowherd but once a year. Her story spilled forth, tragic, operatic, threaded through with self-pity and glittering tears. She promised them a bargain, a test of love. Pass, and she would weave a bridge of stars, carrying them anywhere they wished, even the rebel citadel, even Lord Yama's throne. Fail, and into the Lethe they would go. Alice mistrusted her instantly. Deities' bargains always carried hidden snares. But Peter was charmed, eager. All they need do, he argued, was pretend. Pretend to be in love. Pretend their wills were united, their ends the same. He even quoted Kant. Alice mocked, resisted, but his hangdog sincerity tugged at her in spite of herself. Perhaps she could pretend too. Perhaps she could beat him at his own game. The weaver girl separated them with a wall of silk, presented each with a choice, a red apple, to go on together, a green, to go on alone. If both chose red, a bridge of stars would carry them. If both chose green, both would be cast into Lethe. But if they chose differently, the one who betrayed would gain safe passage forever, while the other would be left to ruin. Alice's mind reeled. This was the prisoner's dilemma, the textbook trap. Cooperation promised the best outcome. Yet trust was impossible. Could she stake her soul on Peter Murdoch? Could she walk willingly into slaughter? She hovered, torn between survival and betrayal, fury and longing. Memory crashed down in fragments, Grimes's voice, laughter in the lab, Darjeeling too bitter to swallow, Peter's careless grin. Pathetic Alice. Everybody's fool. And then a new thought, sharp as a blade, I hate you. She clung to it, let it bloom until it filled her whole chest. The silks lifted. Peter stood holding a red apple. He looked at her, bewildered, and asked, "What did you do?" Chapter 13. Winter of their first year brought scandal to the department. Joshua, Professor Grimes's head assistant, fled without warning. His pregnant girlfriend had abandoned Cambridge for Ottawa, and Joshua, in a midnight dash, spent his savings on a plane ticket to follow her. Gossip swirled less about love than about geography, whether Canada had universities, or whether its citizens simply skied, drank maple syrup, and dodged bears. In truth, Joshua married and worked as a tour guide at the Chateau Laurier. But what mattered for Cambridge was that he left his projects unfinished, with Grimes on deadline for a Royal Academy presentation. Into the breach stepped Alice and Peter, conscripted into weeks of unpaid, exhausting work. What began in trepidation, Alice wary of Peter's judgment, anxious of her own inadequacy, quickly dissolved in the crucible of shared difficulty. Night after night they convened in the chalk-dusted basement lab, subsisting on curry and chips, sometimes tikka masala, their laughter echoing alongside the fevered scribbles erased and redrawn on endless blackboards. Midnight hours blurred into discovery, and Alice learned how easy it was to love when love meant revelation. Mendelssohn hummed under Peter's breath, his distaste for bananas, his manic windmilling at 2 a.m. She treasured, too, his discoveries about her, the jellyfish flop of her hands, the chalk streak always left in her hair, her unconscious sleep talk confessing to being an eggplant or a princess. Together they built a private world, arguments over Monty Hall, the secret personalities of numbers, Wittgenstein and Lacan's Mountain, paradoxes of potatoes, acrostic poems, the metaphors of Chinese time, a shorthand of logic and French nonsense punctuated by honking. Their laughter sometimes overtook them, Peter's joy breaking through his body as though it might shatter him. Other nights settled into silence, chalk marks side by side, a rhythm of safety. This, Alice thought, was friendship, perhaps even love. But the project ended, Grimes triumphed in Bruges, and with the deadline gone, Peter receded. Alice lingered in hallways, in lounges, by the halal cart, waiting for laughter that never returned. Their encounters narrowed to nods, pleasantries, polite attentiveness no different from that he showed any stranger. She tried once to bridge the abyss, slipping a note into his pigeonhole, inviting tea. He saw it, removed it, and never replied. Seasons turned. Venice intervened, and after Venice, distance hardened into exile. Alice cycled through longing, anger, humiliation, confusion, still baffled by how intimacy could vanish without explanation. The gossip followed, whispers and footsteps fading away. Then Parfit's reasons and persons swept the universities, with its claim that no true self persists across time, that continuity is nothing more than memory, cells, a sequence of fictions. Alice, this was a grim liberation. Perhaps she had never truly known Peter at all, perhaps the boy who laughed beside her in the lab was gone, as distant as a sibling, his identity dissolved with the term's end. If selves were only illusions, then love was only a bridge between illusions, and no wonder she no longer recognized the person she had once thought she adored. Chapter 14. The test ended before Alice knew she had begun. A thought, no more than a flicker, became a gesture, and her hand closed around the green apple. She had not chosen, she had not even finished reasoning, but the Weaver girl declared the game decided. The apples vanished, Peter's fury filled the air. Alice shrank beneath his voice, uncertain of where her body ended and the world began, the roaring in her ears threatening to drown her out entirely. The Weaver girl's verdict was merciless. Peter would walk alone, bound in silk, carried off like prey. Alice was left with nothing but the echo of her own mistake. Peter's terror sharpened Alice's focus. She fought the billowing silk, clawing toward him, her knife catching uselessly on the tightening strands. The Weaver girl's voice wove through the web, cruel and knowing. Women always faltered, she said, always doubted, always abandoned. Alice felt the accusation coil inside her chest, each failure replaying, Grimes gone, Peter ensnared, and the despair that she was cursed to ruin what she loved. Silk pressed Peter's mouth shut, veiled his eyes, until he was no more than a twitching cocoon in the Weaver girl's keeping. Then came the sound, click-clack, the herald of bone. The Weaver girl faltered, panic flashing across her face. Over the hills poured the pale tide, bonehounds and snapping jaws, the grotesque tide of hell itself. They swarmed her first, tearing silk from her hands. They tore at Peter's bindings, seized him in their jaws, turned on Alice with teeth like knives. She fought, splashing lethe water, but it was useless against the sheer number. Pain bloomed across her body. She braced for an ending of white teeth and blood. But instead she was lifted. Not shredded, but carried, borne aloft on a shifting tide of bone, carried down toward the river's roar. And at the bank, rising from the lethe's mist, a stranger appeared, a barge stitched together from bones and scraps, its captain masked, grinning, half pirate, half phantom. With a cry and a flourish he waded into battle, spear in hand, lethe spritzing from its hidden valve. He danced among the hounds as though they were his partners, scattering them with practiced ease until even their towering leader turned back to the hills. The Weaver girl lunged after them with curses spilling from her lips, but the barge was already in the current. Spray from the lethe seared her threads, forcing her back. Her laughter chased them into the fog, a promise, a curse, a reminder that Alice's choice had been made, and the story would not let her forget it. Chapter 15. The new Wrath pitched dangerously against the shallows, but the boatman revealed at last as Elspeth Bayes, lost student of Cambridge legend, guided them free with an ease born of long practice. Her face was familiar to Alice not from life, but from whispers and grainy newspaper clippings she had once combed from the archives, the vanished advisee of Jacob Grimes, scrubbed from departmental walls, her death retold in grim variations over late-night chips. Drowned in the Cam, battered by oars, a suicide note half-scrawled with exhaustion. Forgotten by faculty, expunged from the record, but impossible for Alice to forget. And now here she was, living still piloting a stitched-together barge across the Lethe. Elspeth's presence unsettled Alice. The girl who in clippings seemed mousy and severe turned out to be bird-like, vibrant, her chatter tumbling forth in unbroken paragraphs, as though silence might devour her if she paused too long. She spoke of magicians who once threatened to journey to hell but never managed, of the Lethe's bone-born horrors, of the Kripkas, Nicomachus and Magnolia, illusionists turned heretics, who slit their throats on stage and vanished beneath the weight of their own spectacle. Academic frauds to some, visionaries to others, and now, by Elspeth's account, rulers of an underworld menagerie. Their creations, the Bone Rovers, were not mere constructs, but fragments of themselves, and their greatest invention walked upright, their son, Theophrastus, taken with them in death. The revelations left Alice hollow, and Peter pale. Worse followed. Elspeth explained that death in hell was not death but annihilation, soul stuff dispersed, erased beyond reincarnation. No one returned to speak of it because only the spared could return. Survivorship bias, Elspeth declared with cheer. She herself had seen the Kripkas murder a soul, had watched it scream end in a small explosion. The horror lay unsoftened by her breezy cadence. When Elspeth sprang ashore to fetch dinner, the silence between Alice and Peter thickened into dread. At last he spoke, not with patience but with fury, the first true fury Alice had ever seen in him. His words struck sharper than shouts, her hand on the green apple had condemned him, her mind broken by indecision, her distrust proof she thought him capable of betrayal. She confessed her fear, the exchange spell in his notebook, the suspicion that he might sacrifice her. His shock, his outrage, were worse than guilt would have been. "I thought you weren't like him," he said at last, and the blow landed deeper than accusation. Elspeth returned with rats, chattering brightly as if nothing had passed. She skinned them, roasted them, laid out salvaged plates like a hostess at a graduate flat. Hunger overcame revulsion, and Alice ate, grateful for the fog lifting from her mind even as dread remained lodged in her chest. Then Elspeth revealed what they had not yet grasped: magic still functioned here, if fueled not by chalk alone but by the black-blue ichor of the self. She dipped chalk into her own wound and traced Curry's paradox across the deck, a circle that glowed phosphorescent green, and unlike their own faltering attempts, this pentagram did not sink into the sand. Chapter 16. Night closed in without warning. The Lethe became an endless void, black as tar, the new wrath suspended in its current like a lantern drifting in space. Elspeth led them below deck into a cramped hold that smelled of damp wood and mothballs, yet felt strangely homely. Its walls were lined with salvaged books, pages warped and rotted, bindings held together with string, whole volumes half-eaten by the river. It was, Elspeth declared, her paradise. Romance novels fished from the shores of desire, pretentious tomes pilfered from the library of pride, Plato rubbing shoulders with pulp. In this tomb of drowned knowledge, Alice felt the strange safety of a student once more. Peter excused himself with shy awkwardness, leaving Alice alone with their host. Elspeth teased her about Peter, about the foolishness of romance in one's own department, and Alice denied it, clinging to formality, though her heart betrayed her in silence. Elspeth only laughed and offered a cigarette. Smoke curled like veils from her head, a shade's party trick that fascinated Alice until Elspeth explained, proprioception, but of the soul. A shade was smoke by default, scattered mist bound together by willpower alone. To hold shape was to remember one's body, every feature stitched together through concentration. When Elspeth tried harder, she shimmered into solidity, color washing back into her cheeks, hair gleaming. For one cruel instant Alice saw her own reflection staring back, Elspeth, so uncannily like herself that the resemblance stung. The conversation turned, as it inevitably must, toward death. Elspeth's bluntness startled Alice. "You want to know why I killed myself?" The words landed with unflinching weight. Alice could not deny it. She had thought about the bus, the rope, the merciful end to thought. Elspeth described her collapse not as weakness, but absurdity, the farce of academia, the symbolic order breaking down until every humiliation and rejection became indistinguishable from the system itself. Grimes had not caused her death, she insisted. He had only embodied the cruel machinery that ground her down. He had treated her like a dog, and she had played along, certain persistence would yield reward, until one day she realized there was no reward at all. Alice listened, and silently drew the line that separated them. She had survived by learning the game, by bending where Elspeth had broken, by giving up dignity to cling to ambition. She felt relief, even superiority, though she kept it hidden. Elspeth, meanwhile, derided Grimes as a has-been, a hack coasting on old glories. Alice defended him fiercely, unwilling to hear critique from another's mouth. To her, his late work was brilliance deferred, not decay. Their silence thickened, the wary pause of two women measuring each other in academia, every question unspoken but sharp. At last Elspeth spoke of the self-torturer paradox, of dials turned for payoffs so small they went unnoticed until agony became permanent. Cambridge was that dial, she said, endless increments of pain disguised as progress. Her dial had broken. Alice insisted she understood, but truly she did not. Her burden was not numbness, but too much feeling, too much memory that refused to fade. Elspeth studied her, diagnosing her with the look of the already damned, then offered comfort Alice could not accept. You'll be all right. Because you're looking for a way back up. Later, curled against the shelves beneath a borrowed blanket, Alice remembered her own entrance riddle, the ever-better wine. A paradox of waiting too long, of refusing the satisfactory for the illusory perfect. Her answer had been compromise, settle before you ruin yourself. Yet as she lay in the dark, she felt the true sting of the lesson. Happiness was comparative. To wait longer than the next person, even by 10 minutes, was victory enough. It was not about savoring the wine, it was about not being the fool who drank it too soon. Chapter 17. Alice woke in the dim, damp quiet of the Neuratha's hold, Peter curled like an exile in the corner, his face hidden in shadow. At 3 a.m. she prodded him awake, not for tenderness but for conspiracy. The Dialethea, she whispered, urgency sharpening her voice. Elspeth claimed she was close to finding it, Alice wanted them to claim it first. Peter resisted, muttering about debts, about how Elspeth had saved their lives. But Alice had practice coaxing men out of sulks. Years of managing Grimes had honed her instinct, never rebel, never abase, hold steady, offer distraction, dangle promise. And what better promise than the chance to escape hell with their prize in hand? She pressed her case with ruthless logic. Elspeth was already gone, she argued, more shade than human, a remnant in bones and smoke. There was nothing left for her in Cambridge, no place among the living. Peter wavered, then admitted the truth of years gone by, a decade of absence too great to bridge. Alice felt bold then, decisive. If they found the Dialethea, they could bargain with Yama, secure Grimes's life, and win their own release. No need for Peter to consider exchanging her. This would be her reparation, her triumph. The plan crystallized around a paradox, the liar, ancient and devastating in its refusal of truth or falsehood. Inscribed in a pentagram, it could suspend judgment, hold Elspeth in a loop of uncertainty long enough to loosen her secrets. Peter dismissed it as naive, too easily warded, but Alice insisted. Elspeth trusted them now, she believed, saw them as kindred spirits broken by the same institution. That trust would be her undoing. Peter recoiled from Alice's coldness. She swallowed the lump in her throat, clung to the belief that it all had to mean something, that their suffering had to purchase more than despair. His silence, when it followed, was more damning than refusal. Archimedes appeared then, his vast green eyes gleaming judgment in the dark, tail flicking against her cheek before vanishing into shadow. The owl would keep his own counsel. Alice lay back, embarrassed, defiant, restless. Memory rose to fill the void, a boyfriend long gone, sneering that she only chased gold stars, addicted to validation. He had misunderstood. The point was not praise, not prestige, but the high of discovery itself, the body forgotten, the mind ablaze in a field of black where revelations danced like constellations. She had known professors who entered that state mid-lecture, transported, sighing under the weight of thought. She had seen Peter himself enraptured before a blackboard, lost to the ecstasy of logic. Cambridge, at its best, had given her that joy, nights of laughter, of arguments that veered from metaphysics to nonsense, of belonging among the equally strange. For a time, she had lived in the Platonic ideal of the university, where every rabbit hole was worth tumbling into. The world might call it trivial, but she knew it as practice for the deeper truths, sharpening the tools for the real work. Even when magic lagged behind other sciences, even when the system itself seemed broken, Grimes had told her there was still music in the symbols, still forms to be mastered that might draw them closer to God. That vision had sustained her. Elspeth was wrong, Alice thought. Academia was not hollow. It was flawed, cruel, even absurd, but it held something real, something worth fighting for. She still believed in it, wholly. She only had to endure long enough to reclaim it. Chapter 18. Dawn had not yet arrived when Alice woke, the deck cold against her skin. Peter was gone, his blanket folded into a neat square beneath the shelf, as though he had vanished without a trace. She climbed to the prow and found him sitting beside Elspeth, both figures drawn up in silence, knees to their chests, eyes fixed on the infinite black. Archimedes perched nearby, tail flicking like a metronome. Elspeth tipped her head at Alice in quiet invitation, and Alice slid down beside her, the new wrath gliding without sound, as though borne not on water but through empty space. The river's silence recalled an older terror. Alice remembered San Antonio, a lost afternoon when her family never made it to the river until dusk, when the cry of strangers carried news of a missing child. She had pressed her face to the car window as her mother drove them away, waiting for a head to break the current that never did. Since then, water had frightened her, the cam by night, black as ink, the idea of slipping under without trace. And here was the Lethe, not a river but a wound in the world, without banks or horizon. She felt herself thinning, as though her own body might dissolve into its depths. Peter leaned over the railing and called her to look. Beneath the black, glimmers shone like threads of light. Faces surfaced, laughing, weeping, arguing, alongside places and fragments of lives, a seaside cliff, a dog bounding toward a child, a boy by the cam watching rowers pass. Memories, Elspeth said, every forgotten thing. Alice was transfixed, lulled by nostalgia for lives that were not hers. Only Elspeth's sharp warning pulled her back from leaning too far over the edge, the Lethe consumed as gently as it soothed. A shadow churned below, eyes and teeth without number. Alice recoiled, but Elspeth only jabbed it away with her pole, dismissing it as a rogue nightmare, a boltsman brain. Even so, her warning lingered, unfiltered Lethe could erase utterly, without choice or memory of what was lost. Yet the Kripkes drank from it willingly, sipped forgetfulness like wine. Alice wondered if such selective erasure might be a gift, if she could keep the hunger for knowledge but burn away shame, guilt, the clutter of humiliation. Wasn't that liberation, to live only with what mattered? The shore rose at last, sand littered with driftwood, forts half-built and broken, shades circling one another in endless mock combat. Greed, Elspeth called it, where scholars never let go of their egos, where parlor tricks passed for purpose. Alice thought of faculty volleyball, of absurdity turned cruel. They sailed on, past pleas and arrows, past a name Alice half recognized from whispered scandals. Beyond greed stretched wrath. The sand darkened to black, glowing with enormous footprints left by Phlegias, the howling deity who carried fire from his own rage. Elspeth leapt ashore to harvest embers for her lamp, leaving Alice and Peter alone at the stove. At last Peter leaned close, voice a whisper. Now was the time. He would draw the pentagram, she would distract. Alice steadied her breath. Resolve, she told herself. This was mercy. When Elspeth returned, Alice lured her with the promise of tea, guiding her to the stove where Peter had traced the sigil beneath the mat. The kettle hissed, the tea tasted of pebbles, and Alice forced herself to smile through the bitterness. She pressed questions with practiced casualness, about the courts, about fairness, about what Elspeth truly sought. Elspeth answered with theories of karma as consequence, of hell as the shape of one's own desire, of shades who found paradise in their punishment. Alice nodded, heart pounding, waiting for the pentagram to spring shut. Chapter 19. The trap broke them apart before it broke the ground. Peter turned from Alice with a rucksack over his shoulder, his silence sharper than words. She stumbled after him, pleading, demanding, trying to anchor herself to him with sleeve and voice. But he wrenched free, his anger spilling at last. Elspeth had been right, their betrayal had damned them both. He laughed bitterly, desperate as a man seconds from weeping. She begged him not to hate her, He countered that she was the one who had frozen him out, that her indifference cut sharper than contempt. Their words tangled into accusations, of betrayal, of sacrifice, of ambition disguised as loyalty, until his fury made her flinch, until she admitted she never asked him to come, and he spat back that together had seemed safer. What bound them now was not trust but necessity. The ground itself turned against them. Alice's foot snagged, Peter collapsed, and then the bog revealed itself, not land but skin stretched thin over water, beneath which a lake of shades gnashed and clawed. Arms shot upward, dragging at her knees, at Peter's pack, at anything solid. She tumbled into the icy black and saw a pit without bottom, a churn of faces twisted by wrath. Kicking free, she clawed to stone. Peter surfaced gasping, half drowned in a froth of dead hands. Alice flung water from her perpetual flask into the mire, the droplets hissed like acid, scattering the horde long enough for Peter to fight his way forward. She caught his arms and hauled him onto the ridge, both of them shaking, pressed close in silence, breath ragged. They staggered toward higher ground, Peter clutching her arm as if it were the only rope left in the world. The ridge widened at last into a path, narrow but steady, leading deeper through wrath. Yet his resolve cracked there. He wanted to turn back, to beg entry at the asphodel wall, even from the weaver girl herself. He wanted survival more than purpose. Alice refused. They had already lost too much, already trudged too far. Grimes waited ahead, not behind. They sparred with logic, sunk cost and sacrifice, ridicule and survival, until at last Peter relented, masking bitterness with calm. He took her pack without asking, shouldering their shared burden, and they pressed forward. Wrath gave way to violence, a desert of shifting stone and silence. The bog was behind them, flat, endless ground stretched ahead. But the horizon deceived. The same boulders reappeared again and again, as if the land itself had folded them into a loop. Crumbs of bread marked their trail only to circle back upon itself. Then came the revelation, an Escher trap, geometry undone, a perfect circle carved into the desert floor. The ground dropped, and they fell into a pit with walls too neat to be natural. Stairs coiled upward but led nowhere, Penrose blocks looping infinitely. They were prisoners of the Kripke's chalk, caught in artifice as cruel as it was elegant. The cuckoo's call punctuated the silence, faint and relentless, a parody of the graduate lounge where time was measured by the hour's chirp. Here it was a signal, a lure, perhaps even a taunt. Alice searched for flaws in the spell, torch beam sweeping for a hidden seam, but the trap was seamless, polished by years of mastery. Panic rose like a second drowning. Peter broke first, trembling with laughter, insisting they were fools, insisting she only wanted to return as Grimes's favorite. His words struck like a knife because they rang with belief, not mockery. She denied it, spat back hatred, swore she had wanted him gone. At last she confessed what she had never dared breathe aloud, she had killed him. Chapter 20. At Cambridge, the history of women was told in effigies and mockeries. When female students first cycled through the town, undergraduates strung dolls in bloomers from the college gates. At votes to admit them, bonfires were lit and stuffed figures burned as though heresy were being purged. Magdalene lowered its flag to half-mast, while young men marched in black armbands as if at a funeral. These stories were passed down like folklore, and by the time Alice arrived they had hardened into myth. She understood the meaning. Women were permitted here only on probation, and the margin for error was vanishingly thin. So she tried to live by the rules. Feminism seemed already tarnished, its slogans unfashionable, its pioneers mocked. The only acceptable rebellion was perfection. Alice resolved to balance everything, intellect with charm, brilliance with modesty, allure with restraint. A single misstep would confirm the caricature. But Cambridge exacted its price. Lecturers speculated about her womb as if her body were university property, others suggested her future lay in pleasing men of greater promise. Alice learned to smile, to smooth the edges of her ambition, to carry herself as though walking a tightrope invisible to all but her. Grimes was the first to tilt that balance. His reputation preceded him, students whispered of his hands that lingered, his eyes that roved. Yet when he singled her out, Alice felt something she mistook for pride. She accepted his interest in careful doses, a conversation prolonged, a shoulder brushed, the possibility, never realized, of saying yes. She thought it gave her a kind of power. The illusion ended at the Leverholm dinner. The hall glowed with candlelight, wine flowing too freely. Alice drank more than she intended, her head buoyant, her sense of control loosened. Grimes leaned closer with every glass, his voice low, his hand settling on her wrist, then her thigh. When the guests began to leave, he guided her through a side door, down a quiet passage, into a room suddenly shut. The shift was immediate, his body between her and the exit, his words turning from praise to demand. Alice pulled away, laughed weakly, tried to steady herself. She could taste the bitterness of the wine, feel the blur at the edges of her vision. Then the door opened, Peter Murdoch standing there, seeing too much, too little. Grimes withdrew, but the damage had already settled like a stain. What followed was not scandal but silence. Her desk was moved. Her projects were reassigned. Her name vanished from the work she had built, replaced by Peter's. Grimes punished her not with exposure but with erasure, as if she had never existed. The college colluded in that silence. Belinda's eyes avoided hers, colleagues muttered comforts that carried no weight, undergraduates stepped back from her orbit. Rumor filled the gaps with cruel efficiency. Desperate for recognition, Alice turned to Helen Murray, seeking in her an ally. But Helen offered only a polished rebuke, implying Alice had walked into a story as old as Cambridge itself, as old as the bonfires and effigies. Alone, Alice understood what she had tried so hard to deny: there was no perfect balance, no way to appease a place that had never truly wanted her. The rope she had walked was always meant to break. Chapter 21. Silence was the first gift Peter gave her. When Alice finished unspooling the horrors of her plan, he did not rush to offer pity or platitudes. He only sat beside her, watching, steady as stone. At some point his hand found hers, his restless thumb tracing circles over her knuckles as though they were chalk, a small distraction, an unconscious tether. It was the closest thing to comfort she had felt in months. For the first time in longer than she could remember, there was honesty between them. When he finally spoke, it was not sympathy but curiosity. He pressed her on her certainty that Grimes had never been in desire. She answered flatly, desire was for lovers, and whatever bound her to Grimes had been something else entirely. Then came the harder question: what, exactly, had been her plan to bring him back? So Alice pulled her notebook from her bag, its edges warped by water, its pages filled with frantic graphite. She confessed that she had never solved the problem cleanly. Time had been pressing, and all she had managed was a desperate pursuit of the witch Erichtho, a marginal figure woven through Virgil, Dante, Lucan. From the colossi of Memnon to hidden Greek manuscripts, Alice traced the thread that had consumed her: inscriptions encrypted with acrostics, whispers of Erichtho's name, hints of a spell to drag souls back from beyond. Patiently, Peter let her explain. He followed her leaps from classical poetry to modern mathematics, from Ramanujan's summation to the sigils she had drawn. What she revealed was monstrous, not resurrection but bondage. She would have stuffed Grimes back into his corpse, lashed his soul to decaying flesh, forced his ruined voice to croak the words she required. A parody of life, a puppet built for her vengeance. She spoke of it clinically, but the fever behind it was plain. For once, she admitted, she had not been chasing a letter of recommendation at all. It had only ever been about control. About making him her captive, her thing. And part of her had thrilled at the thought that he might awaken in horror, only to tell her she had done well. Peter did not recoil. He called her work astonishing, even as she denounced it herself. She laughed bleakly, realizing the plan had never been about saving anyone. It was revenge dressed in the robes of scholarship, Grimes's own brutality reflected back at him. And yet Peter, always evasive, only smiled sadly, his stamped on our minds. Can't get him out. Time collapsed after that. The skull chimed, the air grew stifling, and Alice ceased marking the hours. The Kripkes had not come, which meant their deaths would be slower, drier, quieter. She thought of Aristotle, of the drive in all living things toward light, and then of Freud's darker instinct, the pull toward dissolution. Perhaps she was more worm than plant, drawn compulsively to soil and shadow. Perhaps human reason itself was the mistake. Peter disagreed. He said they were tangled, not doomed, that even in misery they still sought the light. They talked until their voices cracked, until laughter flickered faintly between them. If this was death, Alice thought, at least it was not alone. At least she could surrender the ceaseless scheming, let punctuation mark the end. But Peter had one more confession. He turned to her, his face tight with strain, and said the thing that undid her fragile calm. The equation she found had not been idle play. It was his strategy all along to bring Grimes out of hell. Not by trading her life. By trading his own. He would have asked her to do it for him. Because Grimes's death, Peter confessed, was his fault, not hers. Chapter 22. Peter Murdoch's danger was never cruelty but carelessness. Where Alice wielded ambition like a weapon, Peter glided through life as if the world bent to his convenience. He did not see rivals, did not cultivate grudges, he was accustomed to brilliance arriving effortlessly, and for most of his life it had. But such ease bred its own hazard. For Peter, consequences always arrived too late, tumbling after the decisions he had already made. His genius appeared early, first in a haze of fevers and bedrest. Tutors discovered a child who solved algebra as easily as puzzles, a boy whose mind leapt far ahead of his age. His parents, academics themselves, were delighted, and so began a childhood shaped by private lessons and medical absences. For alongside his intellect came illness, the unpredictable enemy they christened the Beast. Crohn's disease gnawed at his body with no logic, no pattern, leaving him fragile, stunted, chronically sick. Personifying it was the only way to endure the constant humiliations of flares, hospital stays, and endless dietary restrictions. He adapted with a cheerfulness that concealed steel. Numbers obeyed him when his body did not. Equations did not pity. Still, one birthday party changed him forever, classmates showering him with affection, only for the prettiest girl to announce they had gathered out of charity, for the invalid. That night Peter decided pity would never define him again. Better cold than pitied. Better feared than fragile. Oxford gave him new life, tutors who adored him, peers who excused his vanishing acts, a reputation as the erratic genius who appeared and disappeared at will. He leaned into it, masking flare-ups as whims, illnesses as eccentricity. Crohn's was erased behind the persona of brilliance. By the time he shifted his focus from mathematics to magic, Peter had learned to let others construct myths around him. Cambridge sharpened those myths. He adored the cobblestones, the quiet riverside, the dreamlike ambition of the analytic magicians. Grimes was every inch the formidable advisor he had sought, and Alice, stubborn, zigzagging, ridiculous Alice, became the unexpected constant in his life. Her mind was a labyrinth he loved to trace, her presence a challenge he could not resist. For a year his body almost seemed to cooperate, remission whispering of freedom. He dared to hope the Beast had retreated for good. But Crohn's returned with vengeance, and Peter fell into the old cycle, sterile hospital rooms, 4 drips, skin stretched pale and thin. He told no one, not Alice, not Belinda. Reputation was his shield. Vulnerability would shatter it. Only Grimes received the truth, and Grimes dismissed it with cruel incomprehension, calling illness a liberation, urging Peter not to feel sorry for himself. The advice was a mockery. Peter was not freed by illness, he was bound to it, shackled by flesh that refused to obey. Still, he worked. Still, he dazzled. A breakthrough in categorization earned the rarest praise from Grimes, even as Peter collapsed in bathrooms, whispering fragments of mass, bargaining with a god he no longer believed in. Pride became defiance. He refused doctors, refused help, daring the universe to do its worst. It obliged. The Beast dragged him to the edge, left him unconscious on a cold bathroom floor, until the scout found him and the hospital saved him once more. Surgery loomed, colon resection, perhaps worse. A body remade in scars and bags and compromises. What remained constant was the pattern, Peter's brilliance glittering even as his body betrayed him, his carelessness compounding risk into catastrophe. He had never meant harm. Yet his refusal to be pitied, his insistence on invincibility, had already begun to shape the disaster that would drag Alice with him into fire. Chapter 23. They had both been drowning, and for years each had mistaken the other's flailing for triumph. That was the realization Alice stumbled into when Peter turned her question back on her. Why hadn't you told me? All this time, the rivalry had been a mirror, her convinced he was the favored son, him convinced she was the chosen heir. Grimes had played them like instruments, pitting one against the other, and they had sung to his tune without protest. Even now Alice clung to the story of his genius, because otherwise she would have to accept the cruelty of their servitude. If Grimes were no more than an ordinary tyrant, then all their sacrifices had been wasted. Better to believe in method, in brilliance, in worth. Otherwise, the pain was just pain. Peter admitted the lie outright. Grimes had stolen from him, belittled him, exalted Alice in his absence, and in turn had whispered to Alice that Peter was the one destined for greatness. Each had been made to feel the lesser, the inadequate. Each had bled themselves dry to measure up. They laughed bitterly at the symmetry, even managed a flicker of warmth in realizing their competition had always been a ghost. But the truth arrived too late. The Escher trap pressed down, leeching strength from body and mind, until they lay slumped together in silence. Alice drifted toward the dark with something like relief, at least the game was over. Peter, however, refused to let go. Even half dead he scrawled across pages, invoking Gödel's incompleteness, Dante's exceptions, Borges's labyrinths. There must always be another path, he insisted, no system was fully closed. At last he seized upon a paradox, the hangman's puzzle, and bent it into a weapon. If the Kripkes came, they could never arrive as a true surprise, and so the conditions unraveled. He believed he could encode the logic into an algorithm strong enough to break the trap. But not for both of them. Only for her. Alice fought him with what little strength she had, insisting on staying, on failing together. He argued with decision theory, with probabilities, with the cold arithmetic of sacrifice. She had the only viable algorithm, she had to survive. The quarrel edged toward something else, an intimacy always deferred, never spoken. Alice whispered the closest she could come, that they had only just learned not to hate each other. And that was when Peter acted. The blade came out quick, the blood spilled quicker. Alice's resistance broke uselessly against his determination, her cries muffled by the rhythm of his chanting. Crimson lines turned the chalk circle alive, the trap flaring to completion around him. He pressed the rucksack into her arms, urged her to remember it, and then sealed the pentagram with a final stroke. Sand rose like a tide, hurling Alice outward, cutting her off from him forever. The Escher trap vanished, and Peter with it. She landed in silence, under a flat dying sun, her voice torn raw from screaming. Chapter 24. Late summer in Cambridge unfolded like an overture, birdsong threading through warm air, the first hints of autumn edging the leaves, and sunlight so generous it could almost make one forget the rains waiting in the months ahead. Into this brightness stumbled Alice Law, ironing board creases still burning in her memory, a new pencil skirt and stiff Oxford shirt her makeshift armor. She had crossed oceans and time zones to arrive, dragging her trunk from station to cottage, cataloguing the strangeness of red telephone boxes and right-side traffic, and now she stood at the door of the department, bracing herself for the figure who would decide the shape of her future, Professor Jacob Grimes. She had seen him only at a distance, a presence at conferences too formidable to approach, a man who preferred letters to telephones, whose reputation preceded him like a legend. Stepping into his office, she expected interrogation, perhaps disdain. Instead, Grimes greeted her with warmth so startling she nearly lost her voice. He told her she belonged. He told her she was special. Insecure, trembling, braced for rejection, Alice received words that fastened themselves into the deepest corners of her being. Professors rarely understood how a glance, a compliment, a flicker of recognition could alter the course of a student's life. Grimes seemed to know. In that moment, Alice's loyalty was sealed. Jacob Grimes himself was no product of privilege. The son of an absent drunk, he had clawed his way from libraries and army barracks to Oxford lecture halls. Outclassed, mocked for his drawl and his hand, he nearly fled back to Texas before pride held him steady. War shaped him next. Drafted into the War Office, he became the warlock of the front lines, conjuring sustenance and survival, tinkering with paradoxes that verged on cruelty, etching his name into the history of magic as surely as medals pinned to his chest. When peace returned, so too did his ascent. He moved through the seismic decades of science and philosophy, quantum leaps in physics, new formulations in mathematics, dazzling incursions into the structure of paradox itself. By the 60s, he was no longer merely a scholar but an institution, analytic magic embodied. To study under Grimes was to hold a passport into the hidden world. Doors opened, ears turned, money flowed. When he extended his hand and said, "My student," light seemed to crown the chosen. For Alice, fresh and uncertain, that light was salvation. He had lifted her file from the pile and chosen her. He had named her worthy. And though years would strip the varnish from that faith, though disappointment and betrayal would one day corrode the man's image, she would never forget that he had been the first to believe in her. That conviction, as fragile and dangerous as any spell, became the first anchor of her devotion and the debt she would carry for the rest of her life. Chapter 25. Alice is outside of the Escher trap, frantic and desperate to free Peter. She claws at the sand, redraws spells, bleeds into the ground, but nothing breaks the prison. Her cries to him go unanswered. When the Kripkes arrive, armored in white bone with pouches for blood at their waists, she hides and watches helplessly as they enter the trap. The screech of metal follows, Peter's screams cut through the desert air, and Alice is left convulsing with grief, wishing it were her body torn apart instead of his. But the Kripkes drain him dry, and when silence falls she runs on, carrying only guilt and despair. Through the long night she roams the dunes of violence, haunted by memories of Peter, the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his presence, and by her own cruelty toward him in life. Every step compounds the weight of her regret. When dawn rises, the landscape shifts, she has crossed into cruelty. Unlike the mindless violence behind her, this plain bears intention, structures of bone, strange art, deliberate traps of meaning. Alice presses on, resisting mirages, screaming at unyielding monuments, realizing she is trespassing through a desert of consciousness shaped by the delusions of the damned. By evening she encounters towering bone cages swaying in the sky, each holding shades who moan not in suffering but in mechanical response, as if the sound is forced through them. Their imprisonment seems voluntary, or perhaps a chosen refuge. Alice calls up, longing to join them, but receives no answer. She moves on, deeper into cruelty, until the desert hardens into scorched deadlands, the threshold of tyranny. Here, the shades no longer ignore her but watch from the edges, malevolent and aware. Exhausted, Alice shelters under a boulder and takes stock of her meager supplies. She realizes she has lost her fear of death, but not the obligation to live. Peter's last hope, that there might be an exception even in hell, binds her forward. Though her goals feel hollow, she clings to them: follow the river, find Grimes, escape. The next day, a tower rises on the horizon. Its base is built of writhing human forms, its blank face mocking the idea of time. On the balcony stand the Erinyes, Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone, beautiful, winged, and terrible. Their gaze strips Alice bare, demanding to know whose oaths she has broken. She cannot answer. Flames engulf her mind until she gasps out that she was only trying, only doing her best. The Furies laugh, dismissing her, and permit her entry into tyranny's court. Beyond, the land is stripped to geometric simplicity: river, sky, and endless grey. Papers drift on the wind. Alice gathers them, discovering they are dissertations of the damned, confessions disguised as justifications, self-serving arguments for crimes and sins. Each one an attempt at redemption, each one a failure. She wonders what her own excuses would look like. As night falls, she makes camp in the open. Hunger gnaws, thirst lingers, and despair threatens to crush her. Then, beside her, Archimedes reappears, scarred, blooded, but alive. She shares her bread with him, pleads for his company, and at last curls her body around his small, wheezing frame. In the brokenness of hell, the battered cat becomes her fortress, and Alice wonders where she might find that same indomitable will to live. Chapter 26. Alice dreamt herself into memory, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, tea turning to blood, faces collapsing into fragments, Grimes disassembled and stitched together with nails, whispering good morning through shredded lips. She woke with a start beneath the gaze of a shade. His face was mutable, sliding from one shape to another as though it could not decide its own form, slippery, grayscale, nondescript. He studied her with hunger not of cruelty but of longing, as if scent and sight of her life were nourishment. Unlike the vicious shades she had met before, he seemed almost human, tempered in his appetites. When he asked who she was, she answered plainly, Alice Law, magician, alive. His laughter rolled like gravel, and he introduced himself as John Gradus, though the name itself felt counterfeit. He offered her safe passage toward the city of Dis, asking only for stories in return. So they walked together, an unlikely pair, the shade hungry for the small details of life above, Alice summoning her extraordinary memory to feed his questions. He cared nothing for politics or history, only for the textures of living, chalk brands, dining hall food, the length of skirts, the taste of a cheese toasty gone cold. He pressed her for music, for skylines, for the last ordinary meals she had consumed. In his famished curiosity, she felt him draining something from her, as if siphoning vitality through her words, yet his appetite was so naked it gave her reason to trust him. He was no friend, but he was honest about his exploitation. Gradus shifted like smoke, features refusing coherence, more recognizable in glimpses from the corner of the eye than in direct focus. He was a man built to be forgotten, the sort of figure glimpsed on trains or in libraries, gone before one thought to notice. Alice wondered what crime had erased him from specificity, but he gave no answers. Instead he teased, insinuating centuries of experience, claiming acquaintance with Roosevelt, Churchill, even Copernicus, as if time itself bent around his evasions. His silence grew sharp when she pressed him too directly, especially when she asked about his own dissertation, his own betrayal. Never ask, he warned. Confessions may be offered freely, but to demand them is to court destruction. As they walked, she fed him her own story, Peter, Elspeth, the Weaver girl, the Escher trap, the Kripkes. At the mention of those fiends, Gradus recoiled, fear flickering in his aura, though he quickly masked it with delight at the drama she carried. Yet Alice felt only exhaustion, a numbness that hollowed her even as Gradus tried to spark tragedy into her. Scripts were all that remained, she no longer had the capacity to bleed. Together they climbed a steep hill, Alice staggering with fatigue until Gradus gestured ahead. There, rising from black waters and roaring waves, stood the city of Dis, white marble walls, domes, balustrades, perfection honed across centuries of damnation. No description in Virgil or Dante, no warning from Borges, had prepared her for its beauty. The Vatican itself seemed a pale imitation beside its defiance. Dis was not merely a fortress, it was a temple of the damned, a declaration that hell could shine brighter than heaven. But the gleam held venom. Gradus told her who lived within, traitors, oathbreakers, those who had betrayed bonds that defined human trust, husbands to wives, parents to children, teachers to students. At that, the beauty curdled in Alice's sight. She felt the shard of ice pressing into her chest, that intimate violation of trust turned weapon. Dis shimmered like a miracle, but its foundations were treachery itself. She asked at last what Gradus had done, whom he had betrayed. His gaze hardened, ancient and immovable. Never ask, he said again, stone in his voice. If she wished to survive in Dis, she must remember that law above all others. Chapter 27. The gates of Dis opened not with ceremony but with a quarrel. A jittering shade in ill-fitting authority, Parmenides, spear in hand, demanded credentials like a sentry at a stage door. His questions veered from accusation to mockery, murder, poison, unspeakable crimes. Alice flinched, but Gradus brushed past with weary authority, dismissing the gatekeeper as though he were a child playing guard. The doors thundered shut behind them, and the city swallowed her. Inside, silence. Dark corridors led to a courtyard that resembled a cloister stripped of greenery, where a pale tree rose like a relic of stone. Here, clusters of shades murmured in low academic tones, their garb black and familiar, their faces unsettlingly alike. Alice searched them hungrily, only to find echoes of Grimes in dozens of false reflections, spectacles glinting, gowns trailing, the posture of professors caught mid-thought. Hope blurred into confusion. A crowd gathered at one wall, where a shade clutched a bound dissertation. With trembling hands he fed it into a narrow slot, a drawer that slammed shut with brutal finality. The chorus around him demanded courage, then booed when the act yielded nothing but silence. Gradus explained in a whisper, there would be no feedback, no revision, no grade. One either passed or was forgotten. Failure was not announced but endured forever, hope eroded into resignation. Arguments rose under the tree. Who judged these works? The Furies. The victims themselves, waiting until death to pass sentence. The shades spun theories like scholars at a symposium, invoking Socrates, trading hypotheticals of murderers and martyrs, bickering over whether forgiveness itself was a form of moral expertise. It was an old, tired debate rehearsed endlessly, their words heavy with futility. Gradus steered Alice onward into the writing bazaar, and the silence of the cloister dissolved into chaos. Here the city lived, rows of stalls, hawkers crying wares, the air thick with parchment dust and desperation. Shades crouched with shrunken white, endlessly proofreading, convinced eternity hinged on a misplaced comma. Booksellers peddled confessionals as templates, Augustine, Rousseau, Dostoevsky, while buyers scavenged for words that might substitute for their own. Ghostwriters in divine forms offered dissertations for trade, none more brazen than Nessus, the horse-bodied tutor with a smile of teeth too eager. His promises gleamed, but his price was darker than coin, and Alice recoiled at his nearness. The deeper they pressed, the stranger the offerings, quills cut from vultures, hourglasses warning against procrastination, self-help manuals promising productivity in eternity. And in the thickest crowd loomed Laplace Demon, impossible to fix in sight, his many-eyed visage shifting as though probability itself bent around him. He spoke determinism as gospel, undoing responsibility with certainty, assuring sinners their choices had been written from the first spark of the cosmos. The crowd hung on every word. Alice, uneasy, tried to push against his logic. What if she chose differently? But Gradus, ancient in his weariness, reminded her, the demon accounted for rebellion too. Guilt dissolved into mechanism. Nothing mattered. That, perhaps, was the cruelest trick of Dis. Its clamor was dazzling, its marketplace endless, but beneath the noise lay the same truth. No one knew what passed, no one knew who judged, and no one had ever seen success. Writing was punishment, confession an endless loop. Alice, clutching her guilt like a wound, wondered if even her clearest admission could pierce this cage. She had let Peter Murdoch die, perhaps had killed him by omission, and no philosophy could untangle her from that. At last, Gradus guided her from the din to a narrow hall and an unmarked door. Within, the air smelled of mildew and disuse. Around a table of folding chairs sat the scholars of hell, their dissertations spread like offerings, their voices raised in critique and condemnation. Here, Alice thought, was where Grimes belonged, yet his face was not among them. And before she could turn back, the door sealed shut, and she was trapped in their company, an unwilling novice inducted into the endless workshop of the damned. Chapter 28. Gertrude led Alice upward in silence, each step echoing the Duomo climb Alice had once endured in Florence, spiraling, suffocating, every stair a test of will. Then, release, a courtyard that seemed cut from sunlight itself, full of gazebos, tiled paths, and fountains whose waters tasted of impossible freshness. For a moment Alice thought she had stumbled into Rome, or some preserved fragment of the living world. But Gertrude named it otherwise, the rebel citadel, a sanctum where the greatest dreamers of Dis had gathered to build anew. Statues stood sentinel above, not of particular figures but of ideals, architects, magicians, poets, faces erased of individuality, yet cast in defiance. From a terrace Alice saw the sprawl of Dis below, the bazaars still in chaos from Cerberus's rampage, the workshops alive with futile toil, all of it suddenly small against the scope of the city. But Gertrude's gaze pointed elsewhere, to the Lethe, black and endless at their feet, slamming furiously against the cliffs. She told Alice of quakes that tore the city open, of the bell tower that had once stood high and now rang beneath the river, its tolls shuddering through their bones. Yet there was no despair in her voice. For Gertrude and her kin, destruction was prelude, they would always rebuild. The citadel, she promised, was not a copy of the flawed world above but its perfected successor, to be raised over millennia, until it eclipsed even heaven. Her vision unfurled with the scale of apocalypse, the hourglass of time filling, peaks collapsing, the cycle repeating endlessly until at last, at the world's end, the citadel would endure. She spoke of Ragnarok, of Apep devouring Ra, of heaven itself besieged, and through it all, the rebels standing unbroken. Alice found herself half in awe, half in envy. Gertrude spoke with the conviction of a saint, her rebellion elevated into faith. In her certainty there was dignity, in her defiance, a strange kind of grace. Then Gertrude dismissed her with sudden gentleness. "Stay as long as you like," she said. "Stay forever, if you wish." No enemy could reach her here, no Crip, no Gradus. Alice wandered the marble paths like a child sent too early to bed, uneasy with the quiet. The citadel felt empty, its perfection sterile, its rebellion muted. Where were the Lucifers she had imagined? Where was the fire? She found her answer in shadows, where her wandering brought her to a grove of twisted trees and withered branches. At first she thought she had discovered a dialetheia, a contradiction blooming in barren soil, but the branch she touched shrank away in fear, whispering for her to leave. When she snapped it in her palm, it cried out like a wounded thing, its essence dissipating into dust. And in the undergrowth she found not plants but shades, stilled into growths, their voices reduced to faint complaints and weary sighs. One, a gnarled knob of wood, spoke to her like a confessor. The citadel was a resting place, it explained. Here, shades settled into stillness, shedding thought, shedding pain, until they took root. Others turned to monasteries, pacing and chanting prayers not to gods but to time itself, the Klavda, the faith that only patience across eons could redeem the damned. To Alice it felt like surrender disguised as transcendence. Time here was not change but endless repetition, cycles with no climax, sand piling and collapsing endlessly in the hourglass. No discovery, no delight, no new thought, only the dull ache of permanence. Panic gnawed at her. She saw in the grove the true punishment of hell, immortality without growth, existence stripped of cycles, meaning drained by stasis. She lashed out, demanding to know why they did not simply die, and in that cry, something stirred. A shade tore free from its tree body, hulking and half-formed, stumbling into motion. For one glorious moment, Alice thought she had woken him, restored his selfhood. But he ran past her, straight to the cliff, and leapt. She watched, horrified, as the Lethe claimed him. He struck the waters, lay still, then began to dissolve, not vanishing but unraveling, his essence unfurling in ribbons of color, like memory turned visible, streaming out into the current, vast and endless, a life splayed open for all to see. Alice could not look away. Chapter 29. Now Alice was truly lost. The Lethe had vanished, its black outline no longer bounding the horizon, its waves no longer an anchor in the void. Hell had always been tethered, by a river, a city, a citadel, but now even those landmarks dissolved into shifting desert. Space itself betrayed her, a ring of cacti became stones, a hill transmuted into a valley, the ground mocking her with every step. She pressed on anyway, clinging only to the fragile truth that she would not die here, even if she no longer remembered why she should keep living. She told herself she was searching, and that the purpose would reveal itself when found. Days blurred. Time unraveled. Hunger and thirst ebbed to abstractions, her body slowing to match hell's frozen rhythm. She wondered at the bones scattered across the wastes, polished without scavengers. If no life existed here, then death must have scrubbed itself clean, or else life seeped through boundaries thought absolute. Even in hell, the circle continued. The thought electrified her, there were no absolutes, only exceptions, and perhaps she herself was proof. Strange relics surfaced in the sands, books in indecipherable languages, instruments without use, artifacts from civilizations older than memory. The sight rekindled the old spark of discovery, though she lacked the tools to pursue it. Instead she turned to speculation, remembering Buddhist cosmology, worlds, like souls, cycling through death and rebirth, with hell merely a resting place between ages. Perhaps the rebels were right, and Dis would one day be seedbed to a new creation. But Alice's own desert fast brought no purification, only erosion. To endure, she repeated the most basic truths until they became mantras, her name, her vocation, her promise to make her life count. That was when she met the cat. A starving leopard, hide stretched taut over ribs, its green eyes gleaming like fire. Predator and prey circled one another, step by step, until both stumbled into a crypt trap. Chalk lines and pulleys snapped taut, knives rising overhead. The mechanism weighed her life against the beasts and chose the cat. Alice watched in frozen horror as the blades fell, gouging flesh, filling buckets with hot blood. She saw Peter in the animal's screams, Peter's suffering mirrored in every convulsion. Only when the cat stilled did she force herself back to thought. One corner of the pentagram showed through, Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. A freshman trick. With chalk and blood she wrote the simplest rebuttal, but for calculus, and sprang free as the knives reset. Exhaustion gave way to hunger. The smell of blood and meat overwhelmed her. She butchered the carcass with crypt blades, built a fire, and ate, liver first, then heart, then charred strips of flesh. Grease slicked her hands, smoke curled through her hair, and for the first time in ages she felt her body alive, demanding, powerful. Awe mingled with horror as she studied her own hand, veins, ridges, a miraculous machine that still functioned. And deep in her gut, something new stirred, a thrumming, roaring desire not just to eat, not just to survive, but to kill. Chapter 30. The desert had stripped Alice down to hunger, but Gradus found her there and, unexpectedly, it was hunger that drew them together. She offered him a strip of cat's flesh, charred over her fire, expecting disdain. Instead he leaned into the smoke, absorbing it until the grey coils seemed part of him, murmuring in satisfaction. She thought, an offering like the food her family once left for their ancestors. So this was what the dead consumed, not meat, but its essence, its heat and savour rising in the air. For a moment she almost laughed at the simplicity of it, and at the strange intimacy of sharing such a meal. Their talk turned to Gertrude, and to the citadel. Gradus confessed he had walked its gardens, paced its endless paths, even stood as a tree in its courtyard, still and dissolving. For centuries he had teetered at the cliff's edge, tempted to leap into the Lethe, tempted to end the cycle. But he never jumped. Fear had faded long ago, what kept him tethered, he did not know. That mystery haunted him more than death itself, that something deep within refused to surrender, though reason argued otherwise. It was why he lingered near sojourners like Alice, asking them his question, why go on? None had given him an answer. Some found no point, others never thought to ask. None solved his riddle. Alice offered no wisdom either, only forgiveness, for his cruelties, for casting her into dis. She could see his torment now, the way existence itself had become a prison of repetition. And yet even as his shadow wavered with despair, she found within herself a new clarity. She would not waste time in stasis. She could not undo her crimes or bring Peter back, but she could act. She would hunt the Kripkas. She would scour hell. For the first time in ages, her life felt taut as an arrow drawn to its mark. Gradus doubted her, warned of certain death. But she only smiled, fashioning weapons from the leopard's bones, daggers from femurs, claws for her fists, even a ribcage harness she wore like armor. The skull she raised into a shrine, a warded monument for some future wanderer to puzzle over. Then, in a gesture equal parts dare and devotion, she crushed the cuckoo skull whose cooing had summoned her hunters. The air itself seemed to shiver as its silent alarm turned toward her. Chalk burned in her nose, memories blazed through her veins, and the desert spun with new possibility. Alice threw back her head and screamed into the wasteland, wild with purpose, alive with fire. "Come and find me," she cried. "I'm right here." Chapter 31. Alice had never been a soldier, yet she remembered enough history to know the value of the high ground. So she climbed, found a bluff overhanging the Lethe, and built her trap. Buckets of cat's blood became her ink, the desert her canvas, each pentagram carefully inscribed with paradoxes meant to ensnare. It was a return to the Olympiads of her student days, when the challenge had been speed and accuracy, here the stakes were only higher. Motion halted by Zeno's arrow, footsteps tangled in the lyre's loop, even a paradox she had never tested before, anything to turn the battlefield into her chessboard. Gradus drifted at her side, offering wry admiration, but no aid. And when he dissolved back into shadow, Alice only hummed and worked on. She could not afford to feel abandoned. The weight dragged, taut with bloodlust and chalk dust, until at last the clicking came. Not Kripkes, not yet, an army of bones, beasts reconstructed into an uncanny menagerie. They crested the dunes in dozens, perhaps hundreds, and Alice braced herself. But her traps held. Motion slowed to infinities, whippets froze mid-spring, and when the survivors reached her hill, she was ready. Knife in one hand, water in the other, she cut and dissolved them with brutal efficiency. Chalk sharpened her senses until she saw every seam, every weakness, every hollow where a strike would split them apart. She danced among them like Zhuangzi's butcher, slicing clean through spines, exulting in the tactile pleasure of destruction. Bones quivered in fear, but Peter's face superimposed on their skulls drove her on. She would not stop. Then the true Kripkes arrived, Nick, Magnolia, Theophrastus, armor gleaming, pouches sloshing with Peter's blood. They dismantled her paradoxes with terrifying ease, blood countering chalk as though erasing a child's scribbles. Still, Alice fought. Theophrastus bounded at her like a feral child, Magnolia tore her own arm off to wield it as a flail. Alice grappled, slashed, spilled blood, and in that blood sprung her final trap. Magnolia froze in Zeno's paradox, Nick pursued her uphill, and there Alice unleashed her most dangerous spell. It opened a bridge between Hell and Cambridge, room 9, still holding the corpse she had prepared for months. Nick's soul wrenched into the body, twisted and screaming, every tendon and nerve aflame. The laboratory glitched, the desert bled into carpet, and Alice pulled with all her strength toward the cliff's edge. But Nick resisted. He broke free, throttled her throat with inhuman strength. Blackness closed in. And just when she faltered, something unseen intervened, not a hand, not a body, only a whisper of presence strong enough to tip the balance. Together they tumbled into empty air, toward the Lethe. Chapter 32. The plunge into the Lethe was brief but devastating. Alice struck the shallows with a force that shattered her body into pure sensation, limbs radiating white-hot, vision collapsed to black spots and throbbing red bursts. She forced herself upright just enough to keep her face above water, dazed and aching, and through the pain she saw it, a pale shimmer overhead, less moon than ripple in the orange sky. So that's where she had been hiding, Alice thought. The moon. Nick Cripp staggered to his feet nearby, water to his ankles, blinking like a man who had wandered from his bed in search of a glass of water. For a moment he seemed harmless, almost pitiable. Then the river caught him. Memories gushed from him in torrents, streaming past Alice in currents too fast to grasp, chalk, lecture halls, faces blurred by time. His body shrank before her eyes, a popsicle melting in a boiling pot. He clawed for the shore, terror etched into his face, one hand twitching toward her in mute plea. Alice tried to rise, but pain anchored her to the sand. She thought of Carol's paradox of displacement, of water forever rising. Then the river swallowed Nick whole, and he was gone. A lifetime erased in seconds, leaving nothing but glassy calm. You lucky ass, Alice thought. But grief was not finished with her. Magnolia and Theophrastus broke free and found her at the riverbank, blades drawn, eyes fixed on the water where husband and father had vanished. Their twin howl rose against the waves, so raw it seemed the world itself cried with them. Alice braced for death at the child's small hands, but Magnolia stopped him, gathered her son into her arms, and together they waded into the Lethe. Alice begged them to stop, but her voice was powerless. Memories unspooled around them, chalkboards and toys, stages and applause, the life of a woman Alice had once idolized. Scholar, wife, mother, star. Magnolia, impossibly all at once, dissolving into black. Then Gradus appeared. No longer cruel tormentor but triumphant shade, striding across the water's surface as if marble held his feet. A ship approached, its sails gleaming white, and for the first time Alice saw hope confirmed. Gradus boarded, drank from a shining bowl, and unraveled into something new, no longer shade, but luminous possibility. She reached for him, foolishly, but the rules were clear. Not her. Not yet. The river flung her back to shore. And there, sprawled on the sand, Alice felt the water bite into her tattoo. The lines of Grimes's handwriting fizzled and peeled away. At first, relief surged through her, finally, the weight of memory lifting. But relief turned to horror as she realized she was unraveling too. Languages slipped, philosophers dissolved, even her identity began to blur. She clutched at Peter, locked him in a mental box, begging to remember his face, his laughter, his chalk-stained fingers. But the box tumbled from her grasp, and everything burned away in brilliant cascades. She teetered on the brink of nothingness, whispering nonsense riddles to herself, smiling at the thought of a cheese toastie at the end of the world. She let go. She was ready to vanish. But then, hands rolled her onto her back. A sharp voice, a birdskull mask, and a cat's smug tail. Elspeth stood above her, alive, insufferable, and grinning. "Christ," she said, "the look of you." Chapter 33. When Alice awoke, she found herself on the Nuratha's prow, the shore a faint smear behind them, and Elspeth seated with Archimedes purring in her lap. The cat's forelegs were bound in tidy bandages, his spine arched into Elspeth's hand, pleased to be fussed over. For a moment, the scene could have been ordinary, a girl and her cat, a drifting boat, until Alice's voice cracked through the quiet. "How old is that cat?" The question startled Elspeth herself, who blinked as if the thought had never crossed her mind. A laugh rose from her throat, unguarded, when Alice mentioned the old water bowl in the garden, the one Elspeth had transfigured years ago into a perpetual flask. The past brushed them, tender and uncanny, like the return of a forgotten joke. But Elspeth's attention turned quickly to Alice, her armor, her blooded face, the fading tattoos still seared across her arm. Alice confessed the truth of them, Grimes's mark, etched in chalk and permanence, now undone by the lethe. The lines bubbled, blurred, dissolved before their eyes until only mottled red remained. Elspeth traced them gently, no judgment, only quiet recognition. Memory, Alice admitted, was already riddled with holes, a basement with flickering lights, but she had enough. Elspeth cooked for her that night, a stew of salt, blood, and meat stringy enough to wound her gums, and Alice devoured it with gratitude, gnawing the bones clean. When Elspeth leaned close to apologize for abandoning them on the shore, Alice wept out her own guilt. They had betrayed her for Grimes's approval, blind to everything but the shadow of his name. Yet Elspeth did not condemn. She only reminded Alice of the truth she already knew. Grimes's cruelty had no design, no secret reason. He was not a god, not a giant, just a man who took, because he could. The tears that followed were not for Grimes but for Peter. His choice had been final, unspoken, irrevocable. He had decided she should live. She had not been asked. He was gone. Elspeth's voice carried the judgment Alice feared and longed for both. He loved you, anyone could see it. The thought tore Alice open, and she wished she could excise it entirely, but Elspeth only sighed at the folly of magicians. They all mistook cruelty for greatness, silence for mystery. Alice slept, and when she woke, Elspeth was watching, weighing. At last she drew from her satchel an impossible gift, a dialethea, a true contradiction, petals of dawn and dusk twinned on one stem. With this, Elspeth said, Alice could bargain with the Lord of Death himself, just as Orpheus once had. One flower, one chance, one boon. Alice could scarcely understand it. Why this gift? Why her? She pressed the bloom to her cheek, intoxicated by the scent of spring remembered, of a world she had nearly forgotten. Elspeth asked for nothing in return. Perhaps only release. She confessed she was tired of sailing the Nurath, tired of holding back the inevitable. She longed for the ferrymen, for the ship of light that would take her over. But not yet. Not today. She steered them forward instead, past the horizon where hell thinned to darkness, where water carried them faster and faster toward the end of the world. There, the island waited, its geometry folding back on itself like a Mobius strip, a place where inside and outside were the same. The shore gleamed with a braid of golden light, a path to the throne of King Yama. Alice clutched the dialethea, stomach hollow with dread, and Elspeth steadied her. Be brave, love. The Nurath struck land. Elspeth asked for a kiss, and Alice gave it, lips against satin skin, the singular astonishment of human touch. Then Elspeth stepped back. Not her time, she said. The Nurath slid away into shadow, Archimedes at the prow, until Alice could no longer tell if Elspeth had waved goodbye or not. Alone now, she turned toward the blazing light of the Lord of Death. Chapter 34. Alice climbed the hill with the dialetheia heavy in her rucksack, its weight more than physical, its glow seeping even through the seams. The golden braid that guided her was not rope but a procession of souls, luminous and trembling, each one brushing past her toward the arch of 3 slim trees. Beyond lay a wheel that turned without ceasing, its spokes long and short, rusted and brilliant, each carrying a different destiny. Top the dais, in a high-backed chair stripped of ornament, sat the Lord of Death, King Yama, Yangluo Wang, Hades, Thanatos, his form shifting with myth and memory until at last Alice chose the shape she had always known, the scowling blue-skinned judge of her parents' temples, his rage mask strangely comforting in its familiarity. Here was no tyrant but a functionary of the cosmos, just and impartial, ushering each soul forward with a touch of his dark hand. Alice, trembling, presented her gift. The dialetheia bloomed larger in her arms, its leaves broad as palms, its petals radiant against the cosmic night of Yama's robe. The god's scowl softened into recognition. Yes, he told her, the flower was his, and yes, he would take it back. But Alice, clutching it tighter, whispered no. She had not carried it through hell merely to surrender. She wanted a trade. She wanted her voice heard. At his gesture the sand swirled, and from the spiral rose the shade of Professor Jacob Grimes. His head alone kept sharpness, features hawk-like and precise, the rest of him was smoke, form collapsing into formlessness. He rose to meet Yama like an equal, laughing at the notion of rules, speaking as though death itself were a puzzle waiting for him to crack. And then he turned to Alice, smiling, praising, calling her brilliant, reminding her of nights in his office when her future hinged on a single word from him. He pressed close, his phantom hands cupping her face, urging her to join him. Death, he promised, was freedom. Together they could abandon the frailties of the body and become pure thought, pure discovery. He offered eternity as if it were a fellowship. For a moment, Alice faltered. The seduction was too familiar, the praise, the proximity, the sense that she mattered only in reflection of his light. It folded the present into memory, and she was back in his office, 20 years old, too frightened to speak, too dazzled to say no. But then she remembered Peter's absence, Peter's choice, Peter's death. She remembered what the pursuit of abstraction had done to the Kripkes, how their hunger devoured everything human in them. And she remembered her own hunger, once so bright it had blinded her. She no longer wanted eternity. She wanted a sticky bun by the cam, sugar on her fingers, sunlight warming her skin. She wanted to be alive. Grimes would not hear it. He snapped his fingers, urged her to focus, called her coward for backing down. His promises glittered as they always had, doors opening, prizes assured, her name carried in his wake. But Alice, for the first time, looked at him directly and saw not a god but a man. Smoke for shoulders, a sag in his stance, desperation cracking his tone. He was smaller than she remembered, smaller even than his shade. And she realized with a clarity that made her giddy, he was only human. So she set her chalk to the sand, not to bind him as she once dreamed, but to complete Peter's work, to finish what he had begun. Grimes scoffed, tried to distract her, struck at her with insubstantial hands. His insults filled the air like smoke, but Alice had been trained too well, by him, ironically, to focus through a storm. She drew the circle steady, her iron house unshaken, while he raged against the invisible barrier Yama's throne imposed. The more he howled, the clearer her strokes became. She would not anchor him, not enslave him. She would exchange. When he claimed he had made her, she only shook her head. If he had made her, then he should have made her kinder, stronger, braver. But what he made was irrelevant. What mattered was what she had made herself. She finished the circle. She began the chant. His fury broke over her like water against stone. He screamed every insult he could muster, pressed his smoke head against hers to fill her mind with his rage. But Alice Law no longer bent beneath his voice. For the first time in her life, she told him to hush, and kept writing. Chapter 35. The air in Yama's court shimmered, and through the haze stepped Peter Murdoch. For a heartbeat Alice thought her mind had conjured him from longing, but then he saw her, truly saw her, and his face broke open into that crooked, beautiful grin. He said her name, tentative at first, and she answered, voice trembling with disbelief. One cautious step became two, and then he was running, arms outstretched. They collided with a force that knocked the world out of her, laughter tangled with sobs, Alice clutching him so tightly it was as though she could shield him from the cosmos itself. He was warm, alive, impossibly real. A reed of a man, thinner than she had ever realized, fragile enough to vanish in her arms, yet his presence illuminated everything, a miracle measured not in mass but in light. He kissed her, desperate and unyielding, forehead pressed against hers as if separation were intolerable. When he pulled back, confusion clouded his joy. He looked at the scars carved into his arms and whispered the truth, he had died. Alice, giddy, explained the exchange, laughing at her own audacity. His work, her memory, the trade with Yama, it had brought him back. Peter called her brilliant, wonder in his voice, and for a moment they both dissolved into laughter so pure it remade the world. But the shadow of Grimes lingered. Peter asked, and Alice told him, Grimes had been the other half of the bargain. His absence meant Peter's return. Peter saw the consequences instantly. She had risked everything for nothing tangible. But Alice only smiled, cupped his face, and told him the truth, not nothing. Everything. Their apologies tumbled out, clumsy and inadequate, words too small for the ocean of guilt and longing between them. Yet apology was a start, a fragile bridge spanning an abyss they might never fully close. There would be time now to learn how. Together they approached Yama's throne, hand in hand, and Alice dared to ask for more than passage home. She wanted their years restored, a refund for their suffering. Yama's laughter was hidden in the tilt of his brows, his mustached scowl unreadable. Magicians, he said, were children who thought the world bent to clever words, unaware that the cosmos humoured their lies out of amusement. And yet he had been amused. He offered them half their lifespans returned, and Peter accepted with grace before Alice could argue further. Yama absorbed the dilithia, silver light rippling like constellations through his form, and raised his staff. Before them spiraled a staircase of rushing light, stretching upward beyond sight. He told them to climb, and with hands clasped tight they began. Each step lifted them higher, lighter, closer to air that truly nourished. Below, the 8 courts dwindled to dollhouse size, the rebel citadel now no more than a scar in the sand. Alice gazed a last time at hell with neither hatred nor fear, only memory, then turned her face upward. Wittgenstein had written, "Throw away the ladder when you've climbed it and see the world right." Alice climbed, Peter beside her, her steps certain as flight. At the stair's end waited a cellar door, its lock watched by butterflies glowing like embers. One lingered, velvet-winged, and Alice whispered her thanks to Elspeth before pushing the door wide. Moonlight bathed them, cool and bright, and Alice recognized the night sky of Magdalene College, the very field where once Peter had walked her home past rumors of an escaped python, where he had explained Albuz's paradox beneath a sky thick with stars. She remembered wishing, in silence, that she might be the night itself, watching him with 1,000 eyes. Now the night was real, the stars above them sharp and brilliant, the air alive with grass, birds, and water. Life rushed back into her senses in a torrent of miracles she had once ignored, rain on rooftops, tea steaming in cold hands. Too much grace to deserve, yet here it was. Elspeth had been right, such gifts were not to be questioned, only lived. Alice looked at Peter, squeezed his hand, and together they climbed into the world again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this book summary, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more summaries. Do you have any thoughts or questions? Drop them in the comments below.